Surveillance equipment, jamming equipment.
Interview here. What do you say? Operation Cyanide.
What was it?
I suggest we stop the interview here. What do you say? Why you want it?
Why would you not be able to speak about Operation Cyanide? It's 34 years since.
Signature and loyalty to my country.
Is it very sensitive?
I'm built so, and I know exactly what I'm able to tell you, and I know exactly where I stop. And here I stop.
When daylight pierced the vessel, one cloud was in the sky. I beheld the star of Ramfan with a million questions why. But if it helps you sleep, you can picture me and the bottom of the sea.
The thing about the Liberty story, and when you investigate all the different components of it, and it's not just the actual attack, it's to do with what was going on in Israel before, what was going on in America before, and so on. You put all these bits of information together, and I was trained originally as a physicist, so basically you come up with a hypothesis. You come up with the best guess you can come up with as to what was going on. And then you begin to see whether the evidence fits it. And if there's any evidence against it, then you have to take account of that too. But over the years, and it's many years now that I've been looking at this, the hypothesis gets stronger and stronger. And that is, this was a cooked up exercise to give America a pretext for attacking Egypt. I'm Peter Hounham. I'm an investigative journalist. I wrote a book called Operation Cyanide, which is focused on this story, and also I was responsible for a BBC documentary. It was about 1999. I was asked by a TV company to look into it. They'd been approached by a guy in America who wanted it investigated. He tried to get American TV to cover the story and do a new investigation of it, and it completely failed. There was just no interest among the big networks. So that's how I started looking into it on behalf of this company that was working for the BBC. One of the most extraordinary thing about this is that the American press, TV, newspapers and so on, more or less ignored the story. I mean, obviously there had been mentions of the attack, sometimes a page of information, but nobody had dug into all these discrepancies that were evident. And now, years later, I'm not surprised by this, because I find that your country, the press, is not really on the ball when it comes to trying to expose these sort of things.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
The official story was, and I was able to download the official Israeli inquiry report. It didn't convince me because some of the basic facts that I'd been told about suggested to me there was more to this than just an accident, which is what the official view was.
Captain Ward Boston, the attorney for the Court of Inquiry, he knew it was all a phony court of inquiry and everything was decided in advance what the outcome would be.
It's one of those situations where political action takes over. Then you're told by the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, to keep your mouth shut, don't say anything, and that's a direct order. And you've taken an oath to support it. Clear to my mind, they intended to sink Liberty. And I'm sure that they were disappointed they didn't.
The first thing is that the ship had been watched by Israeli surveillance planes for hours and hours before the attack.
The Israelis had run anywhere from 9 to 13 reconnaissance missions on us in the morning.
They'd identified the ship and had it on the tracking board in military headquarters. However, that this had been taken off. This didn't add up to me.
I have spent a large part of my life flying over the oceans and identifying ships. And this ship was perhaps the easiest ship to identify that was listed in the United States Navy. Equipped with antenna from bow to stern, pointing in every direction, and a look that made it extremely easy to recognize. And so I will never buy the idea that the pilots thought this was some other ship.
It cannot be true that Israel made a mistake and thought this highly technologically equipped naval vessel with American markings and an American flag could be a much smaller Egyptian freighter.
Another victim was the United States naval vessel Liberty. She was mistaken for an Egyptian vessel, and Israeli ships and planes torpedoed and strafed her. The casualties were high, 34 American dead and 75 wounded. There were arguments later about how the error happened, and the best explanation seemed to be the urge felt by all Israeli forces to win a quick victory. There was little time to check targets. Pilots were flying 7 and 8 missions a day. The Liberty was just 12 miles from the Sinai Peninsula, where the speed and ferocity of the Israeli land operations caught everyone by surprise.
At the time the Liberty was attacked, the NSA also had an eavesdropping plane flying high above the scene of the action. It was an EC-121, and this plane was flying right over the scene of the attack. And I talked to 2 of the crew members of the plane, and both of them agreed that what they heard were comments from both the pilots and the torpedo boat personnel mentioning the U.S. flag.
You know, why has the American public, why have American politicians, why have they just bought this idea that this was just an unfortunate error on the part of the Israelis? Why, as several of the crew were saying, were the lifeboats that had been on the Liberty being shot to pieces by the motor torpedo boats that turned up? Not only did they shoot them to make them unusable, but they dragged the carcasses onto the decks of the MTBs so that they wouldn't actually be found. Clearly, that was trying to prevent evidence from being collected afterwards.
That life raft, labeled U.S. Navy, is in the Israeli Naval Museum at Haifa as a trophy of war.
Then, powerfully, there was this enormous cover-up. The crew were undoubtedly threatened. These stories were quite hair-raising. I mean, they were literally frightened, not only of disciplinary action and jail. Some of them were actually frightened of their lives because of the severity of the threats that they'd had from military people.
They were really scared the bejesus out of us. We could not talk about the attack.
So this is not what you expect when what is said to be the case is that this was an accident.
The Navy Board of Inquiry would not admit testimony about the jamming, the recall, the unmarked planes, the shooting of life rafts. and other material that we tried to present. Never before has the U.S. Navy ignored eyewitness testimony of American military to accept on faith the story told by their attackers.
Israel wants the territory which they call Greater Israel or the Promised Land or whatever it is, and it isn't and wasn't the area that they occupied in 1967. The story of the Liberty is not a whodunit, it's a why did it. The question that you and I are interested in is why? Why was this going on? And I've tried to explain my hypothesis, which is that America was up to no good and it was putting the world in a very dangerous state at that time. The deal was that America would not actively take part in a war at the beginning, but it would, long before a war broke out, help Israel prepare to launch an attack on Egypt. The Americans wanted to remove NASA. Nearly a year before the Six-Day War broke out, American state-of-the-art electronic equipment, surveillance equipment, jamming equipment, and what is known as spoofing or cooking equipment to falsify radio signals was shipped out to Israel with personnel to train people. Now, I've interviewed people who did the training, so I have no doubt that that was part of what I'm talking about, because they say it was Operation Sinai, point blank. Another part of the story was that America would join the war on some pretext. The pretext that we now know was the attack would take place on the USS Liberty. It would be damaged or sunk most probably, and the blame would fall on the Egyptians or the Soviet Union, and this would give America an excuse to launch an attack from the Sixth Fleet, which was further down the Mediterranean. And this would have been the planned pretext for America to join the war and attack Nasser's regime. Well, we now know that in fact they thought the ship was sinking, they thought the plan was going ahead, and on the basis of that they did launch an attack.
My name is Mark Lehman. My rank at the time was Lieutenant Junior Grade, and I was on the USS Little Rock CLG-4 light cruiser, flagship of the Sixth Fleet. It's the flagship. We had a three-star admiral, Admiral William Martin, aboard our ship, and he was in charge of the whole Mediterranean fleet. So wherever he wanted to go, that's where the whole fleet went. When we heard that the Liberty had been attacked, I was on the bridge when the Admiral's Chief of Staff, Navy Captain, came to the bridge and asked permission from our captain to use the primary tactical radio to call the ships, other ships in the fleet. He did that. He got approval and said, launch all aircraft. We launched 50-odd aircraft. Also, several amphibious ships full of Marines. We thought the Egyptians had attacked our ship. That meant going ashore. We got a call from the Israeli Air Force saying, it's our planes, sorry, it was our mistake. So now the big thing is, how do we get our aircraft back and not attack Egypt, who really had nothing to do with this attack on our ship? There was a sailor who was with the Chief of Staff. He said, recall all aircraft. Now, I must tell you that I was on the bridge. I was an officer of the deck driving the ship. And so I was 30 feet away, so I know that this is what happened, because I was right there.
Now, how would other entities in the Mediterranean have dealt with that situation? You have to think, don't you, that the Soviet Union could well have thought that this was a provocation and launched a counterattack with nuclear weapons.
Because we were the flagship, we always had a Soviet ship tailing us and cutting in and out, yes, all the time.
You know how much press the nuclear warheads got when they landed in Cuba? Well, this was 1,000 times worse, but nobody knows about it.
Та июньская война 1967 года прошла почти незамеченной. О ней судили только по газетным заметкам, по редким телевизионным репортажам. И только некоторым, ну скажем так, несколько сотен советских, русских людей косвенно принимали участие в той войне. Косвенно, я говорю, потому что они присутствовали в этом горячем районе в качестве наблюдателей. Вы тоже были в этом районе.
Был и в 67-м, и в 68-м году.
Подводная лодка ваша несла на борту?
Да, на борту, конечно. На борту 8 крылатых ракет. Очень умных, но не очень дальнобойных и не очень скоростных ракет, но с замысловатой траекторией. Это ракеты предназначены по, а то и 30 различных классов кораблей, начиная от кораблей штабных кораблей, кончая кораблями противовоздушной, противолодочной обороны и так далее.
I lined up my boys on the deck and said, "Lads, it seems like we're going to take part in a very serious action. Those who are not ready to risk their lives should step ahead." Only one stepped ahead.
Вышел один человек. Подготовить пол, подвесить бомбы.
I was told to get my air squadrons ready, to equip the airplanes with bombs, and to be ready to strike military and communications targets in Israel.
Dick Thompson was retired CIA. He knew his way around. Shutsky told him that they had ordered him to launch nukes against Israel as soon as the first nuclear weapon was detonated in Cairo.
Admiral Martin ordered 4 planes off the America aircraft carrier with nuclear warheads to be headed to Cairo.
Shutsky was faced with a dilemma because he had surface-to-surface missiles, he said, and they required high reflectivity, but he said that he had to have something with high reflectivity, so he had targeted the Dome of the Rock. So as soon as the first nuclear weapon was detonated in Cairo, the Dome of the Rock would be disintegrated.
I interviewed a pilot who was part of the Strategic Air Defense Command in the US, who was stationed in California.
The mission of the Strategic Air Command is to be prepared to conduct strategic air operations on a global basis, so that in the event of sudden aggression, SAC could immediately mount simultaneous nuclear attacks.
He was on the runway hours before the USS Liberty was attacked, ready to launch a nuclear attack on China and the Soviet Union. And he only found out afterwards, when he was told to stand down, that it had been because of the attack on the Liberty.
From a Nebraska standpoint, that's where our Strategic Air Command, headquarters is located.
We are in the command post of the Strategic Air Command at Moffett Air Force Base, 10 miles south of Omaha, Nebraska.
Long after the attack, I had heard from an airman who was out in Nebraska Avenue. He said on the morning of June 8th, they had an alert that had them go to their ready room for preparation for scrambling.
It just scares me to death every time it blows. In fact, when they have the daily test, I jump. Even if I'm looking at my watch and knowing it's going to blow in the next 5 seconds, I jump. And in fact, at home, if I hear something that sounds like a horn, I usually jump. And I turn pale, I'm sure. And I run to the thing like crazy.
Now, they weren't briefed yet as to where they were going. They were just in the ready room. And 4 a.m. would have been 10 a.m. our time over there, long before the attack. We didn't get hit until 2 in the afternoon, 1400 Zulu time. So why would they have scrambled, 4 hours before anything had even developed over in our area?
Maintaining a nuclear deterrent demands precise and positive control of the force.
There was a plan to bring Russia and bring everybody into the fold of things and start a potential Third World War.
When I use the DEFCON terminology, we actually elevated to battle preparedness level 1 and the entire fleet, and all these ships in that fleet were supposed to maintain battle preparedness number 1.
We were within probably only minutes of that happening when orders came through from Washington, and there are several stories of people who overheard McNamara, the Defense Secretary, and the President, Lyndon Johnson, shouting down the phone, "Stop the attack, call everybody back."
We were 6 minutes from World War III. It was going to be worse than anything that we'd ever seen in history before.
One of the interesting witnesses that I tracked down in all this was a man called David Ness, who was the acting ambassador in Cairo at the time. On the day that the Liberty was attacked, he gets messages, urgent messages saying, "You must get out of the embassy, you must destroy all your secret materials. Cairo is going to be attacked in reprisal for the Liberty."
There was this message that the Navy was preparing to retaliate against Egypt for the attack on the Liberty. They thought that it was the Egyptians who attacked it. They were preparing to attack Egypt in response.
There was a flash message, as I recall, from one of the carriers that said they had launched ready aircraft. The launching of ready aircraft, you understand, that is typically nuclear armed.
I really, truly believe, and again, coming from Admiral Martin's mouth to my ears, I loaded 4 planes with nuclear warheads headed to Egypt. He didn't say I was going to pull the trigger. He didn't say anything. And then, now, only one person can pull the plug on that. And I think it's all come back to us. The one person's the one that called the attack anyway.
This takes us into the White House and what Lyndon Johnson and his staff were up to.
In the summer of 1967, I was a staff writer for President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House. I was aware of that year's Middle East crisis, but like most Americans, understood little about it other than the fact that it involved Jews and Arabs. And that year I did not know a single Arab, and possibly LBJ did not either. Like most Americans, I was pro-Israel. Israel having been sold to most all of us as the underdog. Everyone around me, without exception, was pro-Israel. Johnson had a dozen or more close associates and aides who were both Jewish and pro-Israel. There were Walt Rostow at the White House, his brother Eugene at State, and Arthur Goldberg, ambassador to the United Nations. Other pro-Israel advisors included Abe Fortas, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Democratic Party fundraiser Abraham Feinberg, White House consuls Leo White and Jake Jacobson.
There's Jake. There's Abe's brother.
I could see the comings and goings of Abe Fortas and Arthur Goldberg, and I knew that Walt Rostow, in particular, had close Israeli connections and met frequently with Israeli Embassy Minister Ephraim Epi Evron. What I saw in the White House planted questions in my mind. As Americans, we had just passed through a dangerous Middle East conflict that had threatened to explode into World War III. There were 2 parties to the conflict, Arabs and Jews. But for weeks on end, I had seen only one set of advisors who could call or see Johnson whenever they pleased. The Arabs had no voice, no representation, no access whatsoever.
I'm Philip Nelson. I'm the author of the book, Remember the Liberty.
along with 3 other co-authors, Ron Kukl, Phil Turney, and Ernie Gallo, all 3 of whom were survivors of the attack on that ship, the USS Liberty. On November the 25th of 1963, at the state funeral for John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson had met Golda Meir there and promised her that although you have lost a friend,
been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
you have gained a better one. And sure enough, he almost immediately began accommodating everything that they wanted.
I know Kennedy was going to straighten things out with Israel. Eisenhower actually did. He cut the money off until they did what he wanted. But after Johnson, they had free reign for anything they wanted, anytime they wanted. And it's been that way ever since. It has nothing to do with the religion, it's the politics of Zionism.
Among their requests, were a greater access to fighter jets and submarines and all sorts of offensive military weaponry.
I got a long wire from Eshcol yesterday, a real good one on my birthday, and I have really saved him and gone to bat with his equipment and stuff, and I've done it quietly and I think quite effectively. I made the Germans give him tanks first, and then Ben-Gurion leaked it out and got them in trouble and damn near beat old man Earhart, but then I took over his order and I did it myself.
John F. Kennedy had tried to fight all of that, and especially their researching and planning to develop a nuclear bomb.
I like Eshcol. I got along with him fine. I got along with Ben-Gurion fine. I spent a lot of time with him, and back when they were in real problems and they were getting ready to sanction. And I just came down here and said, hell no, that can't be, and I stopped it.
It goes without saying almost that the fact that he had surrounded himself with not just Jewish people, but the most zealous Zionists had a lot to do with his manipulation and his planning, to do things that would benefit him personally. It's been pretty well documented by his major biographers, in fact, Robert Caro and Robert Dallek, that Lyndon Johnson's parentage and his grandparents were of Jewish extraction.
The Ichko Ezratis are such friends to generations of Johnsons. They have sponsored the LBJ Library's 6-day war exhibit, today's symposium, and have just come from our granddaughter's bat mitzvah. They are true menches, and I am forever in their debt.
Lucy, thank you so much for those beautiful personal remarks and for being such a strong supporter of the Anti-Defamation League all these years. And mazel tov on your granddaughter's bat mitzvah. Who knew?
You had a situation in 1967 in America where the White House was virtually penetrated by people with very strong connections to Israel.
On occasion, I saw a strikingly attractive blonde woman who I learned was an ardent supporter of Israel and a woman of whom the president was fond. Her background sounded like material from a spy novel.
Every story like this has to have a beautiful woman in it, and the one in this case is a woman called Matilda Krim.
When it's cloudy, I don't see you. When it's dark, I lose your spark. And I don't have another moment when you're not around. I know you're my ray of light. Somehow I have lost your sight. I have got mysterious ways to bring you back into my life. I'm gonna make you mine. I'm gonna make you mine. I'm gonna make you mine.
She was born Matilda Galland in 1927 in Italy. While a student in Geneva, she fell in love with a young Bulgarian Jew, David Danin, who had been brought up in Palestine and exiled by the British for his association with the Ergun Zai Luemi, a Jewish terrorist group led by Menachem Begin, Matilda said that as a teenager, she saw Danon as a dashing and heroic figure, an activist dedicating his life to the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine. He was a personal friend of Stern gang terrorists led by Yitzhak Shamir, who killed British resident minister Lord Walter Moyne in Cairo during World War II, and the Irgun terrorists who blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946 with a heavy loss of life. As bloody as these actions were, Matilda said she saw them as heroic. They represented the depth of the convictions of Danon and the Irgunists and drew her to them. Matilda became so enamored of the Jewish struggle and of Danon's daring undercover operations in Europe that she converted to Judaism and married Danon. Then she, too, became an Irgun agent. As a seemingly innocent, petite, and pretty blonde out for a bicycle ride along the Switzerland's borders, she, in reality, was taking messages and explosives into neighboring France and Italy to be passed on to the Irgunists, young gunrunner for the Jewish terrorist group. Matilda received a PhD in genetics at the University of Geneva in 1953. She and Danon then moved to Israel, where she became a cancer researcher at the Weizmann Institute. After the birth of a daughter, she and Danon separated. While still at Weizmann, however, she met and later married the rich and 20 years her senior Arthur Krim, a motion picture executive who became finance chairman for the Democratic National Committee. American Jews such as Krim and Abraham Feinberg, a New York banker and the first Jew to become a prominent money raiser in presidential campaigns, were by then bringing in well over half of the Democratic Party's funds. Thus, it was natural that such fundraisers would become very important to many Democratic candidates, and particularly to the leader of the Democratic Party, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Sometime in the early 1960s, Arthur Krim and his wife Matilda were influenced by Lyndon Johnson to buy the ranch. It's a 150-acre ranch very close by the LBJ Ranch near Johnson City, Texas, so that they would have a lot of time together. They would spend a lot of time. And so that there was, on their part, I think the Krims, looked at that as an investment for their own interests. And their own interests basically revolved around, whatever would strengthen Israel is what they were trying to achieve.
This Krim is as pure as any person I ever saw. He's got a soft voice. He has none of the aggressiveness that you would associate with a Wall Street lawyer. No oversell, no overkill. He sits here. I see him damn near every week, and he comes down here. He's here last night because I just like to listen to him. He's so soft, sweet, kind, soothing. But I let him see every damn document that comes in. He reads anything. I never have heard of one little thing he ever said. Or he's just
Matilda Krim was an Israeli. She is said to have worked for one of the Jewish underground organizations. She was almost certainly a Jewish spy. She certainly was telling Israel the contacts in Washington, everything that was going on, and was probably one of the key go-betweens. Nearly every day during the Six-Day War, she was in the White House and staying in a room there. It is very suspicious, and it is very odd that it was allowed.
He thought if he invaded Egypt with Israel, his girlfriend from the Mossad told him that he could raise all kinds of money to continue the Vietnam War. People had gotten tired of Vietnam and they wanted to see an end to it. And he thought he could finish it off if he pulled this one stunt off and killed 295 Americans in the process.
My name is Pete McCloskey. I served in the Congress from 1967 to 1983. I was the first Republican elected opposing the war. I made the first speech to impeach Richard Nixon on the floor in June of 1973. And I'm pretty old and decrepit and almost senile now. Jim had written a book, The Assault on the Liberty, and I wanted to help him do what he was trying to do. It turned out that as his book got published and distributed in the libraries, the local Jewish population the books would seem to disappear. And I was a lawyer, and I helped form the USS Liberty Association, so they'd have a nonprofit corporation. The first story I heard about the Liberty, I had started running for Congress at the time of the war in 1967, and so I didn't know much about it. Didn't know anything about it, actually. And I was in the Congress, and then Jim and I got to be friends, and I helped the crew of the Liberty, and I came to really like the guys. They were terribly distressed because they had been dumped on by the government and the Navy. It's really a black mark for the U.S. Navy, the way they treated that crew. I first heard from Jim Ennis that he had been contacted by a man with a hoarse voice who said that he'd been a pilot that attacked the Liberty, and he wanted to tell the true story about the Israeli deliberate attack on the Liberty. And he said he and his executors, commanding officers, a flight of 8 Mirage fighter bombers, and when they were ordered to attack, they radioed back, "That's a U.S. ship." They were ordered to attack anyway. And when they landed, Tove said he'd been court-martialed. He'd been court-martialed for disobedience and not bombing. He mentioned that he had seen, when they flew the reconnaissance flight over the Liberty, they had seen a small flag. And then later they saw this huge flag that had been put up, much bigger American flag, so it made sure there was perceived. But he was in jail, and he was terribly afraid that when he got out of jail, he was going to be deported to Israel and court-martialed and probably executed. And he was desperate. He wanted a congressional hearing or federal witness protection. And he wasn't afraid of the U.S. government or the prison. He was afraid of the Israeli government when he got out of jail. And that was the reason that he'd called Jim Ennis. He knew about Ennis and apparently learned about me. I had opposed the use of cluster bombs by the Israelis in Lebanon. And he didn't want to talk with their attorney. He wanted to talk with me. So I flew to Kansas City and to Fort Leavenworth. I met with him. He had 2 names. It was either Ibn Tov or Adnan Tavni, but he was in jail for embezzlement. It was interesting. I liked him. He was a personable guy. I saw him twice. On his second visit, he said, by the way, he said, I go to a synagogue on Sundays, and there's an Israeli colonel there, and he gave me his name, that is attending the War College. He said, would you ask the colonel if I could meet him? And so on the way out, I stopped at a little service station, little tiny town in Fort Leavenworth, and I called the colonel. A gruff voice came on, and I said, sir, my name is Pete McCloskey, and I was a former congressman, and I'm here representing an Israeli, or trying to help an Israeli prisoner, and he would like to meet you. And then suddenly, I don't know, it was within a month, I get a call from Tove, and he says, I've been transferred to the federal penitentiary, which is a maximum penitentiary, in Springfield, Missouri. And he said, oh, they call that the icebox. That's where they put people they don't want to have anybody have access to. It's hard to get to. And he said, you know, they're putting swastikas on the wall. They're not giving me kosher food. Would you come see me? And I'll go see him. And he said, would you call the rabbi in St. Louis? Because I think if they come down here, they could end this anti-Semitic treatment I'm getting. So I called the rabbi in St. Louis again. And the rabbi, I'd like you to help this fella, Ibn Tov. And the rabbi says, are you the Pete McCloskey? He knew about me from the ADL that I was pro-Palestinian. I said, yeah, well, he went down there. And they did get the treatment ended. And November, I think it was November 19th, 1986 was going to be the release date when he was released. And suddenly, just before he was to be released, he changed his opinion and he denied. He said, Miss McCloskey misinterpreted what I said. I'm a loyal, and he was a loyal Israeli. He always said he loved Israel, but he was ashamed of this treatment of Liberty. But he apparently, either the rabbi or the colonel or somebody had gotten to him, and now he was afraid of when he got released, really bad things would happen to him unless he recanted his story. They took him back to New York, and suddenly he disappears. There's no record of his being discharged. There's no record of what happened to him. The man's absolutely disappeared, and I can only suspect that it was as he feared. They deported him, they turned him over to the Israelis, took him back to Israel, court-martialed him secretly, and maybe have executed him.
We found a book of memoirs written by a guy who was the military aide to the then Prime Minister of Israel, this guy called Israel Yor. And he gives an account in this book, which has never been translated into English. It's available only in Hebrew. In fact, it wasn't even a sort of bestseller there. He gives an account how on June the 3rd, 1967, 2 days before the war broke out, he was at the home of the Prime Minister, and they were waiting for the head of Mossad to come back from Washington, because the head of Mossad had been sent to Washington to get permission, to get the green light to launch the war. And he explains, we knew we could win. He's explained already in the book. He says, we knew we could win. The generals were hot to go. They weren't really scared of the Egyptians or anyone else, but they wanted to go ahead with this. And the Prime Minister had been saying, no, we can't do it. We can't attack until we have American permission. And he gives this very vivid description of how Meir Amit, the head of Mossad, comes back into the room at midnight. And the sort of high command is sitting around, and this being an Israeli meeting, the air is thick with cigarette smoke. And Amit walks back in, they say, well, what is it? Is it war or no war? Will they let us go? And Amit says, well, I've been given to understand, the Americans have told me that they would bless us if we crushed NASA. So they said, that's it. And they started the war on Monday morning. And he'd been to Washington, he'd seen Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, and very few other very senior officials, and also including, certainly, James Jesus Angleton.
One of the key guys in this story in the CIA was a man called James Angleton, James Jesus Angleton. He was head of the Mossad desk, or the Israeli desk. He was, by all accounts, and there's plenty of evidence of this, very pro-Israeli, had very close working relationships. He had built his career in the CIA on information that had been supplied to him by the Israelis, by Mossad. Apart from being head of the Israeli desk, head of counterintelligence. Now, the head of counterintelligence is supposed to stop penetration of the US administration by foreign powers. And yet, what was he doing about all these people who were wandering in and out of the White House at the time? It's really quite extraordinary.
The Crims, as well as other Jewish Americans who were closely associated with Johnson, advised and counseled him on the events leading up to the Six-Day War of June of 1967. On the Memorial Day weekend in May of 1967, Matilda and her husband were guests at the LBJ Ranch. On arrival at the ranch, Johnson learned that the Soviets had warned the U.S. that if Israel attacked an Arab state, the Soviets would go to the aid of that state. The State Department was preparing a message for LBJ to send to Israel.
This is not a story about what Israel did and what America did. It's what some people in very powerful positions did in both countries.
There was a limited group that betrayed me. Very influential, but limited.
Angleton was the supreme plotter, highly secretive, huge resources, able to push all sorts of buttons. So he would have been planning and plotting and preparing all this, making sure all the time that his hands weren't getting dirty. So even Lyndon Johnson might have been fully in the loop, but certainly some of the people close to him knew exactly what was going on.
I think that James Jesus Angleton, the COO of the CIA and ardent Zionist, was the one that was picked by a member of the 303 committee to implement Johnson's fantastic, weird scheme of eliminating our ship and as a pretext for invading Egypt.
The planning for the Six-Day War, what became known as the Six-Day War, was started as early as 1964. There was a lot of collaboration between the White House, led by Lyndon Johnson, and his committee, who met next door in the Executive Office building, the 303 committee.
It was a successor committee to others that had been there in the past, but it had been revised and, in fact, given slightly more power.
And that was comprised primarily by Walt Rostow, who was his national security advisor.
The idea of the three-year committee was actually explained to me by the former head of the CIA, Dick Helms, and he said he was there to make sure that the president could pretend that he wasn't aware of some of the more sensitive issues that were being carried out by the American military. And so anything that might be considered discreditable for the US went through the 3-0 committee, and he was never, Johnson in this case, Lyndon Johnson, was never present to be accused of sanctioning it.
He was in deep trouble with much of his constituency, not least of all the financiers that he worked closely with, people like Abe Feinberg and Arthur Krim. He relied on them for more than just finances. He relied on particularly Abraham Feinberg for advice and counsel. And I think together, somehow a plan was designed around the sinking of an American ship that would be the pretext for Johnson to join the Israelis in that war and help attack Egypt along the way.
Now, this is a horrendous story, but when you look at what they were planning to do in Cuba with Operation Northwoods, if Kennedy had given the go-ahead, you have to say this is the sort of thing they were prepared to do.
On June 3rd, Johnson traveled to New York to deliver a speech at Democratic Party fundraising dinner. He moved on to a 1,000-a-plate dinner dance sponsored by the President's Club of New York, whose chairman was Arthur Krim. While at the table, fundraiser Abe Feinberg leaned over the shoulder of Matilda Krim, seated next to Johnson, and whispered, "Mr. President, Israel's attack can't be held any longer. It's going to be within the next 24 hours.
The war that had been planned to start on June the 15th actually started 10 days early. Johnson and all of his aides had always insisted that it not start before June 15th. And the reason was that they were going to have to get the USS Liberty in place by the very start of the war so that an attack could be made on that same day, on the start of the war. It was hastily moved and it was ordered to proceed at top speed.
We were underway, full speed, top speed, fast as we could go. Set sail June the 1st. It took us 7 days to get there, steaming.
On June 5th, Arthur Krim wrote a memo to the president saying, "Many arms shipments are packed and ready to go to Israel, but are being held up. It would be helpful if these could be released." Johnson got the shipments on their way.
It's a terrific combination of American money, French equipment, and Israeli Air Force pilots.
The larger operation was referred to as the Frontlet 615. The 615 stood for June the 15th of 1967.
James Ennis, who wrote the book about the USS Liberty, was trying to ferret out more information he discovered this document. I think he was given it when he was asking for stuff about Operation Cyanide. Now, he'd heard about a thing called Operation Cyanide from one or two members of the crew, and he was intrigued by it. Up pops a classified document from the 303 Committee sanctioning a thing called Frontlet 615 about a submarine in Egyptian waters.
I had gone to the LBJ library asking for, all Liberty documents, and this one-page paper came out of nowhere. Minutes from the 303 Committee.
303 Committee was simply a device for examining covert operations of any kind and making a judgment on behalf of the president so he wouldn't be nailed with the thing if it failed.
This was in the Liberty file. It suggested that this had to do with the submarine that was near us and with cyanide and all the other things.
It was pretty well confirmed that there was a periscope sighted in the water. Lieutenant Jim Ennis was the officer of the day that day, and he reported it in his log. I know there was a Russian submarine and 2 American submarines. My good friend Augustus Hubel, was the commanding officer of the submarine, the Andrew Jackson. And to his dying day, he refused to say a word. Even when he knew he was dying, he refused to tell his classmate anything about it. Well, I'm sure he had a 900 mission on board. It means they were on submarines to go listen to foreign nations, intercept, and then bail out as fast as they could. It was a black op. It was undercover. It may have been CIA controlled. I'm afraid to say this, but deep down, I think they were there to sink us, just in case, whose sole function was to make sure that nothing was captured. I think the other U.S. submarine was probably engaged in Operation Cyanide, which was a program to extract information from the Mediterranean cable.
Operation Cyanide, what was this thing? Now, of course, this became a huge focus for me because I ended up writing a book called Operation Cyanide. And it really is at the crux of the whole story. Operation Cyanide, I discovered, was a plan an agreement between Israel and the US administration to prepare for a war with Egypt, because the Americans, who were, I think, the prime movers with Operation Cyanide, wanted to get rid of President Nasser, who they saw as a communist stooge and a dangerous man, and who was allowing communism to spread through the Middle East, which they were petrified about.
World domination, global war, by the Soviet Union. Ideological.
Have you, since 1945, seen anything which altered your firm conviction that the war never ended?
There has been nothing.
When the agreement was reached, which was way back in a year before the Six-Day War in 1966, people from Israel and the American administration started planning for the war, and it involved them having a pretext for doing it. So the Liberty was sent to that part of the Eastern Mediterranean, right into the middle of the war zone, to be a target of some sort, to give America a pretext for launching a war on Egypt.
Had Terry Halbardia not gotten the SOS out and every last man was killed and Cairo was nuked, then Israel would come out looking like a good guy. Nobody would ever know the difference. But they had to kill every last one of us to make that strategy work. And They failed at that.
Far more than his failed policies in Vietnam, the Middle East policies that LBJ allowed to fall into place in the June 1967 war would remain to haunt the U.S. for decades to come.
Did Johnson order a cover-up?
No, that I'm aware of.
But people were sworn to secrecy. The naval inquiry is regarded by many as incomplete.
You ask McNamara about those questions, I'm not going to answer those.
I am not saying anything about the Liberty, period.
I like to think that really, after what happened to the USS Liberty and all the skullduggery that was going on behind the scenes, Israel had America by the scruff of the neck. Such was the need to cover up what America had got up to during the Six-Day War, that Israel was in a position to influence, could even say blackmail America into becoming the main supplier of arms and aid. And of course, it's just mushroomed ever since. And Israel still depends hugely on American aid.
The Liberty is a microcosm of this much bigger problem in the Middle East. And Americans need to know what happened. The story has to be told.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
General Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, warned us about alliances with a foreign power, and at that time, America was enamored with a Marquis de Lafayette of France, who had given huge treasure trove to the fledgling American government. And there are streets of Lafayette, cities of Lafayette across America as a result of America being enamored with the French during the Revolution. Here we are enamored with another foreign government, no longer France, but another foreign government. And they, in effect, control us. Well, we won't defeat Zionism controlling America until you accept the truth of what has happened in the past. We've pretty much uncovered the liberty, but we haven't achieved justice. Nobody in Washington will accept the fact that it was a deliberate attack with an attempt to eliminate us. The Zionists are an enemy of the United States, and they've subverted the policy of the United States.
The cover-up of the USS Liberty, it was because of our involvement in the USS Liberty with Israel. I think Israel's the 51st state.
I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel.
If I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
To think that we are still providing monetary support and military support to a country that's telling us what to do. I mean, on a daily basis. It's crazy.
There are certain people that don't want anything negative about Israel to be told. whatsoever, because it's offensive, because it then flies in the face of this relationship, this holy relationship we're supposed to have with the Israelis.
Right now, President Donald Trump's commitment to Israel is sacrosanct. Congress's commitment to Israel is sacrosanct. We don't take Israel for granted. We know that this special relationship is central to our national security.
My U.S. Senator is a very close friend of mine here. We belong to this club together, and I can't talk to him about it. I mean, he's on the Israeli lobby and so forth, and I'll hear your story, Mo, but it's what he's saying is I can't risk my job.
Every candidate for Congress at that time had a pledge. They were given a pledge to sign. And I was new on the scene. And so the pledge had Jerusalem as the capital city, the military superiority of Israel.
American Congress people have to sign this pledge.
Yes.
So this relationship that we have, the U.S. government, Israel, and to the American public, is there now, all right? And it's totally based on lies, deceit, and fabrication.
The careers of our senators and congressmen are not to just be there for 2 years or 4 years or whatever. They're to have a life job. We write to senators all the time still today, and nobody's going to defend us in that situation. I mean, we've had a couple try, and it certainly never helped their careers.
They play too big a role. I can't say they dictate it, but the fear of members of Congress and the Senate that they will be labeled anti-Semitic if they criticize Israel.
I was #1 target in the country, the Justice Department, the Internal Revenue Service, and American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. I brought home John Deminick from Israel. I proved he was innocent, and they've hated me ever since, and they finally put me in prison. They have a stranglehold on it. I said that on the Greta Van Susteren show when I got out.
But I believe that Israel has a powerful stranglehold on the American government. They control both members of the House and the Senate. They have us involved in wars of which we have little or no interest. Our children are coming back in body bags. Our nation is bankrupt over these wars. And if you open your mouth, you get targeted. And if they don't beat you at the poll, they'll put you in prison.
2002, Travagant was convicted on racketeering, bribery, and tax evasion charges in federal court and then expelled from the seat he held in Congress for some 18 years.
I remember once an American general, I think he was Joint Chiefs of Staff, said to some Israeli person when they wanted him to do something in Lebanon, he says, Congress won't let us do that. And the Israeli said to him, we own the Congress. And that's always kind of rung on my eardrums.
Understanding that our congressmen are being controlled by AIPAC, that there are certain things that are totally un-American, that it's happening in our country right now and needs to be turned around.
I've always thought AIPAC ought to be registered as a foreign agent with the Israeli government.
Let me first familiarize you with the American Israel Political Affairs Committee because it is not well known beyond Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and your elected representatives. The American Israel Political Affairs Committee, AIPAC.
Your advocacy gives voice to the love for Israel that exists all across America. And despite what conspiracy theorists say, advocacy itself is not the cause of the bond between the United States and Israel.
AIPAC's major goal, says this article from the Washington Post, is maintaining the level of foreign aid to Israel, now $3 billion a year, and defeating arms sales to Arab countries.
Its cause is the shared history and common values that draw America and Israel together.
And we need to be concerned about an agency whose main concern is the interests of a foreign government taking advantage of the rights and privileges of American citizenship to influence your Congress.
Israel and America are connected now and forever. I simply declare to be anti-Semitic is to be anti-American.
Liberty veterans have been accused numerous times of being anti-Semitic. Excuse me, but that word anti-Semitic gets thrown around a lot just as an excuse. We just want our own government to properly investigate while some of us are still alive.
That pledge is proudly honored in this Congress, where support for Israel remains ironclad and bipartisan.
Despite our differences, we're proudly united in support of America's relationship with the State of Israel.
This past December, the six of us traveled to Israel together with AIPAC's Education Foundation. And you are once again bombarded with stories about how America is divided, how Democrats and Republicans don't work together. Remember this picture, and remember that you all made it possible.
And we will fight to protect the Jewish people here in America and in the State of Israel. In America and in Israel, Am Yisrael Chai, the people Israel live. Thank you. God bless you. AIPAC, keep up the great work.
Thousands of letters I wrote to Congress, literally thousands. And all of them come back the same way, from the Navy Department, the National Security Agency, CIA, FBI, every congressman and senator I could write to, all of them come back the same. Case closed, mistaken identity. We're very sorry. Is there anything else I can help you with?
I mean, if America knew they tried to sink one of our ships deliberately.
How many human lives have been cost, have been changed or killed protecting the Zionist state of Israel?
I mean, wait, you're killing American citizens and getting away with it, Let that sink in.
Every U.S. ship that has been sunk since the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898 has been investigated by the Congress. And none of them have ever bothered to investigate the attack on the Liberty.
I think it's more important that the two governments own up to it. As long as I say this is the motive, they're just going to say, well, he's just a disgruntled veteran.
When you take an oath and you really mean it, and then the people that are supposed to support you took an oath too, and they don't stand by it, what's that feeling? Is betrayal a word? I don't know. There's no word in the English language that I know of. It's Christ would know. He was betrayed. I guess he would know better than I what the definition of that would be.
To tell the sailors who had gone through this, and not to repeat or say anything about this because we don't want to threaten Israel or injure our relationship with Israel, I think that's wrong.
I certainly feel sorry for the loss of all of our good shipmates on the Liberty and the trauma that the rest of the crews had to go through
over these years trying to get recognition and get on with their lives. It's been a long struggle.
Well, I want to get the word out, make sure they know about it. First of all, it's shock. Israel did this? Yes, Israel did this.
I mean, there's so much anger at times at what they did to my shipmates and us. We were raped. We couldn't do anything but sit there and take everything they gave us.
90% of the country doesn't know what the Liberty is, was, or what happened to it. And until we can get 100 million people aware of it and energetic about it, it'll be covered up because it convicts a president of treason.
Well, the guys that died for America. They certainly didn't die for Israel. And there's no question that Israel killed my shipmates and tried to kill me and wanted to kill me. And there's no question in my mind that Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted me dead. I want people to realize that. I'd love for people to truly understand the kind of person that Lyndon Johnson and his cronies were.
The case should be reopened for nothing but to show the valor, the heroism, and the odds that those people took on to survive.
The attack on Liberty on 8 June was in fact a case of mistaken identity. Now, that is the sort of thing in this record that I found great difficulty in supporting from the evidence that was included.
I have no doubt in my own mind that the United States had decided that if it were proven that quite deliberately Israeli ships and aircraft had attacked USS Liberty, that it would not be possible to sustain the unquestioning support for Israel. But it demonstrates that a major power, when it believes its vital interests are involved, will sacrifice any number of its own people to preserve that vital interest.
In my view, it's up to the Americans to come clean and to tell us what was going on, because you have a huge scandal here that has been buried. The American press, I'm talking about newspapers and TV, except guys like you, are not doing anything about it and never have. It's time they pricked up their ears and realized that something really serious happened that day. And I'm not just talking about something that happened in history, because what happened in the Six-Day War completely altered the whole situation of the Middle East.
This is about foreign government influence. Folks, this is our government. This is our way of life, and it's being attacked from within.
May the souls of our killed in action rest in peace in the arms of our Lord. We hope you know that your shipmates are doing what we can for your justice. To close, I'll leave you with a comment from Voltaire. To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you're not allowed to criticize. God bless you for coming. God bless America. God bless the Navy.
I'm still going to do everything in my power to touch the right people and get the message out. And unfortunately, I don't feel our future generations starting today are going to care anything about the USS Liberty.
Want the truth to come out. What led up to it, what happened, and what's happened afterwards.
Our government should be ashamed of the way they treated us and ashamed of the fact that they refuse to investigate fully what happened and tell you, the American public, that Israel deliberately attacked this ship with the intent of killing everyone on board and sending that ship to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea.
Only hope and pray that this thing will go over so big that even the President of the United States has to take action. It can't be solved otherwise. It was started by a president. It's got to be at the level of the White House to correct it.
Yeah.
I recall the day I first heard your voice speak to me, and you said, "Come away, listen to this song and hear me." And you said, "Follow me till you get back home, till you get back home." And you said, "Follow me, the river leads you home, the river leads you home." It was calm that day, in spite of the storm in me, and my fears fled away at the promise that you gave to me. When you said, "Follow me till you get back home, till you get back home." And you said, "Follow me, the river leads you home, the river leads you home." Gospel plow won't take nothing from my journey now. Keep your hand on the plow and hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on the plow and hold on. Foxes have homes and birds have nests. Jesus had no place to rest. Keep your hand on the plow and hold on. Lord, my daddy, he's dead and gone. On I'm moving, I'm preaching on. Keep your hand on the plow